Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us at this special meeting of the Madera City Council. If we could have a roll call, please.
Mayor Andrew Medellin.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Jose Rodriguez.
Here.
Councilmember Cece Foley Gallegos.
Here.
Councilmember Will Oliver.
Here.
Councilmember Derek Robinson absent. Councilmember Charles Rigby.
Here.
And Councilmember Donald Hawley.
Present.
Thank you, Sonia, and also thank you for the goodies to start the meeting. I'm very thankful, but I'm also worried. I don't know if that means we're going to be here a lot longer than anticipated, but it's always great to start out with some snacks and goodies, so thank you very much for that. We always start with our invocation. I will ask everybody to stand with me. Councilman Hawley will lead us in the invocation.
First of all, I'd like to say good evening to everyone. Huh? Oh, okay. Just see if the Lord was talking to me, Most Lord, gracious Father, again, we come to say thank you. Thank you for our city. Thank you for our staff. Thank you for our councilmen and women. Lord, give us a heartbeat that will ring throughout Madera to where we are doing what you have asked us to do. We know that we can't please everybody, oh Father, but through your guidance and through your strength, we know that we can overcome it. And Lord, the song that I had in my mind all week was that I never could have made it without you. And as we all stand here today, Lord, we asking that same question and telling those same stories that we never could have made it. As we go forward into our city to bring up our young people, to encourage them to do the right things and leadership, we ask that you continue giving us a guidance, not ourselves, but through you we can make this happen. So, Lord, I pray for all those that are sick and shut in and those in bereaved this hour. In Christ Jesus' name I say, amen.
Amen. Thank you very much for those words. If you join me in the pledge, please. Ready, salute. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Moving into public comment, the first 15 minutes of the meeting are reserved for members of the public to address the council on items which are within the subject matter jurisdiction of the council. Speakers shall be limited to 3 minutes. Speakers will be asked to identify themselves and state the subject of their comment. If the subject is an item on the agenda, the mayor has the option of asking the speaker to hold that comment until that item is called. Comments on items listed as a public hearing on the agenda should be held until the hearing is opened. The council is prohibited by law from taking any action on matters discussed that are not on the agenda, and no adverse conclusions should be drawn if the council does not respond to public comment at this time. Is there anybody wishing to speak under this definition during public comment? Seeing none, I will close public comment and move right into why we're here. This is our workshop of the City of Madera for fiscal year 2018-2019 and our proposed budget. This report is going to be a duo by Steve Frazier and Tim Presbila.
Should I begin, or should I let Councilman Robinson grab some food?
Yeah.
Huh?
We'll let the record show that Councilman Robinson is joined us. Thank you very much for that. And please feel free to partake in the goodies.
Well, Mayor and council members, it's a pleasure to be here and in discussing the 18-19 budget. To be quite honest, this is a position I never thought I would be in, to be presenting the budget beyond the PD to the council. So obviously, my goal is to do well. So if there's a report card, please fill it out now with all A's and B's so that I can feel somewhat successful. So let me begin by talking a little bit about where we're at today. So in the 17-18 budget, we are on pace to balance the budget. And I say balance, and I say that kind of with a little tongue-in-cheek. We have erased a $900,000 deficit that we began the year with, but the reality is we accomplished that through kind of smoke and mirrors. I don't even know if Wendy remembers saying this, but she alludes to the fact that we have balanced the last couple budgets on luck. And really this year is no different. We were able to erase that deficit and come in with a balanced budget because we had 13 positions that we were unable to fill as a city, and we had higher than expected sales tax this year. So the combination of those two really allowed us to close that gap and represent a balanced budget. But the reality is, had we filled those positions, and we were trying, we would have had a $1.6 million deficit this year. So it's a fine line between being successful and having a balanced budget and having a significant deficit. So 18-19 will start off very similar to last year, that we are facing a pretty healthy deficit. Right now it is $1.5 million. And there's some options that we have presented in your report that brings that dollar figure down. But that's what we're looking at right now, and our revenues just do not meet our expenditures. And there's kind of a lot of things. So I've got some notes on how we got here. And clearly, I don't think it's indicative of any one individual or a lack of any department or anything that ran our budget afoul. But we're going to go back. 1978 and Prop 13 is really where the wheels kind of started coming off for local municipalities. Prop 13 was the property tax initiative that was passed. And then in 2011, we saw the dissolution of the redevelopment agency and the opportunities that provided municipalities. And then PERS and the pension fund and the unfunded liability that we're now required to carry on the books. All those had some very significant impacts on our ability to balance a budget. And then most recently, CDBG. We were able to fund, Bob, pretty much all of code enforcement through CDBG, or the majority of that, to the tune of several $100,000 that CDBG has now disallowed. And so that becomes a general fund liability. So you look at all those things coming together, and this is where we find ourselves with expenditures that outpace revenue. And we'll talk a little bit later about some of the things that we can do to mitigate that. There are certainly some things that we can do. There are certainly some options that we'll discuss down the road that I think are pretty drastic, and I think we should do everything in our power to avoid going down that path. But we also joined several cities that I'm aware of that have finalized their budgets already. The city of Tulare, city of Porterville are both facing a published $1 million deficit. So I think it's not uncommon. Every city has gone through the same things that I described, subject to the same pitfalls associated with those, and I think we'll see throughout the state that cities are going to have difficulties balancing the budget, and we know that that's going to get worse as PERS moves forward, and our ability to manage those kind of things. We hope things fall in such a way relative to the court decisions that it will allow us at some point to manage that a little better and to our individual needs relative to the city. But as it stands right now, the California rule is in place, and that prohibits us from doing that. So, I got some information from Mr. Battles back here. Thank you for that. And some of the things I want to point out that I think kind of where opportunity lies coming. We know that we have loves. We know that we have started a environmental impact on a 5,200 home master plan community that is going to be tremendous for our city. Probably not within the next year, though. I think we'll be lucky to have our EIR back about budget time next year. but the horizon, there's good things in store for us. And I think the goal as the council is we got to find some way to ride that out. We've staff presented information on annexation, and I think there's one thing that clearly defines city revenue and service delivery, and that's land use. Our opportunity to do that right now is within the next year. Our tax sharing agreement expires 2020 or 2021. It's coming up. In other words, our timeline is such, and then you have to go back to the table and renegotiate that, and that takes time, as we learned in that first process. So our ability to move forward and be aggressive and economic development is now. I mean, you have to be ready to move and improve our positioning by annexing dirt that is marketable to bring in the retail businesses. That's really critical for us. So there was a comment that Eric put in here. An economist predicts continued low unemployment. I mean, it across the nation we're almost fully employed, and I think that's unprecedented. And I think the date that Eric threw in there was since 1960 that we have had such low unemployment rates. So we're looking at low unemployment, rising housing values, resilient financial markets, improved access to credit, low household debt, and consumer and business investment as stability markers for the year to come. Those things don't point to the soft recession that everybody's talking about. Those point, at least in the foreseeable future, to a stable market, something that as a community we most certainly can and should take advantage of to the best of our ability. So the future is good, and the time to act on that is obviously now and moving forward, so that we have the ability to balance our revenue and expenditure issues that we have. So I'm going to turn this over to Tim, and we'll come back with an opportunity to talk about some of the options that we have available to us. We're going to do something a little different this year. We're not going to have each department head stand up and go through their line items and talk about the highlights and lowlights. And really, their budgets have remained pretty status quo. And I did forget to mention, before we did anything, I mean, right now, we are in 17-18, and before we even began working on the 18-19 budget, our budget increased $750,000. 500,000 of that was PERS costs, and 250,000 of that is the step increases for our employees. So really, without trying too difficult, not even breaking a sweat, we're almost $1 million more going into the next year, and those things we anticipate to continue to be a problem for us down the road. And so it will be imperative, and I don't want to put the cart before the horse. We'll talk about that as we go. But our presentation, Tim's going to carry the load. If you guys have questions on individual budgets, the department heads are here. They are prepared to answer that. But pretty much their budgets are the same, and we'll go through this, and then we'll talk about how we craft the budget. But right now we're looking at a $1.5 million. We'll come up with some options and seek council direction on what we do from here.
Thank you, Steve, and good evening, Mayor and council members. On the agenda tonight, we have the general fund discussion. We'll go through the summary of general fund expenditures, then we'll hit the enterprise funds, then we'll hit the internal service funds, then the special revenue funds, and then we'll wrap it up. Most of our discussion today is going to be on the general fund budget. So this is the trend in history of the city of Madera. In 2001, 2002, the city budgeted, and that's way before I got here, $830,000 deficit, and they ended up having a slight surplus. In 2016-17, we budgeted $1.4 million deficit, and we realized an $842,000 surplus. In 17-18, Madera budgeted a $1.7 million deficit, which we reduced down to $911,000, and we anticipate, as the city administrator mentioned, that we're going to balance the budget this fiscal year. And typically the largest savings comes from salaries and benefits, and in good years, revenues come in higher than anticipated, and 17-18 was a good year because we had more sales tax revenues come in, a little bit less property tax than anticipated, but a little more sales tax. And right now the fund balance, or at the beginning of this fiscal year, the fund balance is $15.4 million. Of that, the basically $14 million was unassigned, and included in that $14 million is $11 million of reserve, $11.4 million of reserve. And that $11.4 million is calculated as 30% of the general fund expenditure budget. And we're projecting an $870,000 deficit for 2018-2019. Steve mentioned the 1.5, and that 1.5, we'll discuss how you get to that 1.5 or down to the 870,000 from the 1.5 figure that's been mentioned. So Steve also hit on the CalPERS increases. This is a slide from last year. I haven't updated the numbers or anything, but we were told what the changes would be for the upcoming CalPERS expenses, and we've met, if not exceeded, those increases for 18-19, and we're anticipating further increases in the future years. So these projections do not provide for further decreases beyond 7%. Basically, the CalPERS has taken the discount rate from 7.5% down to 7.0% over a 3-year period, with 0.125%, 0.125, and then the 0.25% coming off in the last year. So each year that those happen, that affects the discount rate, which affects our unfunded liability. The city administrator found this information real interesting, and so did I, from our annual financial statements that were presented recently. This is the sensitivity to change in discount rates. So you can see that we have two groups of employees in the CalPERS plan. We have the miscellaneous plan and then the safety plan. And in the top plan, you can see that if the discount rate went from 7.65% down to 6.65%, that the unfunded liability would go from $22 million to $31.6 million. That's a pretty big swing. And then the similar change for the other plan for the city. Any questions on these slides or any comments? Steve, would you like to add anything to the CalPERS comments?
The reason I thought they were very telling is obviously PERS doesn't change their discount rate, but I don't know if it was last year, 2017, I think they did lower that, and so the potential of, if their investments are not performing, there is a potential for them to lower the rate even further, potentially. Obviously, we want them to do well because you can see going the other direction, but this could happen next year, it could happen 2 years or 3 years down the road, and then you look at our exposure relative to that is just incredibly significant. And again, PERS, we know it's going to factor in very heavily down the road. And we just hope that we have the ability as a city to at some point amend that pension plan so that it more fits our needs.
You show these in 1% increments, but if you do the math, even 0.25% could be a $2 million additional liability, because it doesn't go up in whole numbers. Sometimes they'll do a third or a 0.25%. So it's
right. So the 18-19 change, that basically could be considered the equivalent of, that's additional contributions that we have to make because of the unfunded liability increases, which we pay over 30 years. Future liabilities, we're going to have to amortize over 20 years due to some recent changes. But yeah, that's the impact of 1/4% for 18-19, only on the general fund,
Right.
according to the figures we had for last year for this. So I wanted to show this slide of how we've performed in the past with our expenditures. You can see that typically we are coming in at 94, 95, 96. You know, I would say 2015, 2016 was a very different year because we approved the budget that year before we had the compensation study and the salaries increases came out. So that's why we were on budget. All the other years we tend to come in under budget on our expenditures. So how do we balance the 18-19 budget? We need to bridge the $870,000 gap. We have mentioned in the staff report implementing a soft hiring freeze. It's the opinion of the city administrator that really the M&O savings, there's no more savings left because the last 5 years been pounding everybody down and taking those M&O costs, maintenance and operations costs, lower and lower for them. So do we cut back on programs and reduce staff? There's the question of collective bargaining. Will there be any savings generated through collective bargaining? That's an unknown also. Or do we find a way to increase our revenue stream? So I'm going to kind of discuss those points differently and kind of leave it open for discussion here with everybody and welcome input from anybody that may have some comments. The soft hiring freeze, this is the amount that we're saving in the current proposed budget by freezing positions. You can see the positions. I believe this report, this table 1 was also in the staff report. But if you take that basically $700,000 and add it to the $870,000, you're at the $1.5 million deficit that Steve Frazier mentioned just a moment ago. So, and there were also a few positions that were requested that we had in the budget originally, but we pulled those out, seeing that we didn't have sufficient funding for the existing positions, let alone 3 new positions. Any questions on the soft hiring freeze?
So if I can, for the record, primarily because I have Chuck here, and I want to make sure that everybody's aware. There are 3 police officer positions that are frozen, identified as being frozen. That does not include Measure K. Measure K is fully funded. But as you'll see, as we move later into the PowerPoint, there's a pie chart. Public safety takes up 53% of the budget. And for us to ignore those positions would come at the detriment of other departments who would have to, lose the additional bodies. So these represent, with no value given to who they are, what they are all general fund positions, and they are the vacancies. That's it. We didn't weigh that says, oh, this is law enforcement, this is engineering. There are some key positions identified in there. They're there because they were not hired at the time that we started to create this budget. So we took that picture in time, we froze those positions, and this is what's represented here. I just want to make sure that that you understand that this isn't a selection process. This is who was not hired at the time, and we froze those positions.
Thanks for that clarification.
Questions on that at all?
Councilwoman Gallegos.
So these positions we froze that we're not looking to fill, if we're going to a soft freeze hire again?
That is your choice, Councilwoman, on the direction that you want to provide us. We can reduce our deficit by freezing these positions for the next year. And part of that discussion point is if we're not able to increase our revenue and we come around to budget time next year, then I would say that we probably need to start making those evaluative judgments on what positions we permanently freeze. These are just frozen right now for this budget cycle in order to get us in my opinion, which is a little more manageable, but that is a council decision. So however you'd like to see that happen, if you want a balanced budget and you direct me to go get you a balanced budget, I'll make that happen. So this is just reflective of the positions that we had frozen that were non-hired at the time. That make sense?
Yeah, I know that we've been bringing in revenue for our code enforcement off of the rental ordinance that would cover 2 of these part-time code enforcement consultants. It wouldn't be any increase to the budget. It would be revenue that's already been put in there to cover these 2 positions, to get some support for that ordinance that we all voted in.
Yeah, unfortunately, the projections that code enforcement has in shows a pretty significant decline in their revenue.
Okay.
And right now, I'm not sure that would be a offset, one for one person. But again, if you want them back in, just tell us what it is that you want us to do, and we'll make that happen.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Good clarification. Appreciate that, Steve. So that's the soft hiring freeze discussion. And then the discussion on further reductions to M&O cost. I mentioned earlier that we feel like we've already pounded that down. We could look closer if council wants us to. We could look at programs to reduce or eliminate. But it's staff's opinion that really there's not much to, if anything, to save there in the M&O costs. So that moves us on to reduction in personnel costs. And this is a topic that we should open for discussion. So unless revenues improve considerably, positions will need to be eliminated in time. This year, staff is proposing that we leave those 10 positions vacant, except for the one that would be a half year, filled at mid-year. I'm not sure if that was made clear or not, but this parks planning manager, we would freeze that until mid-year. The rest of those are proposed to be frozen for the full year. That's how we came to the numbers to get us with the $870,000 deficit. So the question would be, how do we select those positions or programs to be eliminated? Do we prioritize? Do we decide which ones are discretionary? If we decide to go in this direction with reducing personnel costs through a planned rather than a default, and the default would be that, as Steve mentioned, those positions that are currently vacant, we're just freezing those positions and leaving those vacant at this time to help balance or come close to balancing the budget this year. And then the question would be, when do you eliminate those positions? Do we do it through attrition when somebody retires? And then leave that position vacant? Or do we do it through layoffs? Do we consider furloughs? As mentioned earlier, and I've kind of lumped this in with this one, is there any savings through collective bargaining? And again, that's an unknown. And then last option, do we just stick with a hiring freeze for now? So all those points are open for discussion, input, thoughts. If there's no discussion, we'll move on, and maybe somebody will come back later with thoughts.
Mayor Pro Tem Rodriguez has a thought.
Thank you, Mayor Medellin. So, Tim, or maybe Steve, I might ask the question is, when you have unless revenues improve considerably, what do we mean by improve considerably? How can we have revenues improve considerably? Is this kind of similar to what happened with the sales tax, that we are expecting another year where we might have additional revenues coming in, or?
So we've projected our sales tax for next year based on figures given to us by Muni Services, as well as that's how we come up with this year's figures, also determining that we're up 10% instead of 2 or 3% as we had anticipated. But really, and I'll discuss that a little bit further as far as increasing revenues. But this slide really is on reduction in personnel costs. So maybe that question would be better responded to when we get to that
certainly,
slide.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
But I will ask you the question in regards to the positions that are not filled. What kind of dent does that do to the service that we provide our city right now? Are we going on that? Have we been riding on that for the last year with these vacant positions? I mean,
We did. That's Steve mentioned. That's basically. Go ahead, Steve.
So I want to go back to your first question if I can.
Yes.
So for instance, Love's is $1 million a year tax. Our problem is that we incentivize that tax in order to bring them here. But you have a big box store, a Walmart. That's $1 million+ in tax revenue that comes to the city with that. That's what we mean by improving our ability or improving our revenue stream, is to bring in those businesses. It's to realize the master plan communities and get those things moving. It's bold vision by the council in moving the city forward. Those are the things that need to happen in order for this city to deal with the imbalance.
Yeah, and, maybe I'll save that question for later, but, my understanding was that Love's would only bring a certain amount of revenue back after the reimbursements and all. So I don't know how much of that revenue we're looking at after the expenses.
There's 10 years worth of agreement on those sales tax sharing. At the 10-year mark, then we realize the full impact that we have with that. So we traded our ability to have more income tax in order to entice the business to come in. Very common practice. It's done frequently, but we are still going to receive increases in our sales tax as a result of that, just not what you would experience fully if we didn't incentivize their.
Yes, reimbursements. Okay.
And if I may be in part of those discussions, Steve, as you had mentioned, it's an anchor business, just like a Walmart would be or a Target. And so what we don't know, and it is a little bit of a crystal ball, but as you said, Steve, it is kind of a bold move in making things happen and putting dirt in the air. The ancillary projects that come with a Love's. There's going to be a couple of empty pads there for some restaurants or a hotel and things of that nature. And that will generate a much quicker revenue. So again, it's kind of a crystal ball, but I think it was a bold yet necessary move in order to incentivize to get Love's to move here, because they were looking up and down the 99 at a number of different places. So,
And then in regards, Councilman, to your second question, yes, they were vacant most of the year, which actually allowed us to achieve the savings that we did. Actually, PD had basically 6 positions that were vacant most of the year. And said hire 2. They just hired a trainee, and so they're going to go ahead and move forward, hire 2, and we're going to freeze 3 of those. So they've had 6 positions that were vacant for all of this year.
So, Steve, sitting up here, I wouldn't be able to tell how that affects the service delivery. So maybe you can fill me in that and tell me how does that affect our service delivery within our community?
It's tough to say. Measure K allowed us the opportunity to add bodies significantly. The PD never really got fully vested in that. They've hired all of Measure K, but then there are general fund vacancies. And so we don't really know the potential that was there because they never realized having that fully staffed. But clearly, speaking of PD-wise, it certainly impacts their ability to do more things. But of all departments in your city, the PD is the largest, and 3 positions, when you've added 8, probably has the least impact on service delivery of all the departments. I would say probably the most impacted is engineering, because included in that freeze is a senior engineer. You will see, if you look at their budget, you see an increase in contract services. It means that they have to conduct business a little differently because of that freeze. So they'll be hiring firms to manage projects as opposed to having individuals that can pay attention to that. And so there clearly is some impacts that we're experiencing with the freeze. And again, it just becomes a evaluative judgment from the council on whether you want to do that or not.
So in the case with the engineering, would it cost more money to outsource that service that's required from that? I mean, would we be looking at a cost savings or?
Offhand, Keith, do you know what your increase was in contract services?
Tim, can you go back to that slide of the 10 employees, please?
Our
Contract services has been increased significantly. A portion of that is to hire a part-time draftsman full-time throughout the year. That will allow us to do some of the smaller projects in office. Without the senior civil engineer that you see on there, that will require us to go ahead and potentially change our method of delivery. We've been talking about the potential to go ahead and hire firms to actually do some of the management that we do in-house. When we hire a firm to do a road project or a utility project, we hire them, then we manage them. We can also be managers of managers, whereas we hire a manager that runs 3 or 4 projects outside the office, and we just manage that person. It's been done fairly successfully on the wastewater treatment plant. The Public Works Department hired a firm to go ahead and come up with projects to go ahead and be designed out there. Then they took it out to bid, and working with us, we did some new stuff there. So the contracted services, right now, that's for a part-time drafter. It also includes a full-time engineer that we have back there right now that's assisting us in catching up with projects. So yeah, we are changing a bit how we're doing, just to go ahead and keep the projects moving. We actually lost 2 staff last year, and it took a bit to go ahead and replace them. We lost about 9 months of engineering time, of pure engineer time, and we're trying to catch that back up.
Thank you, Keith. I guess at the end of the day, Steve, what I'm asking is, how lean can we run before we hit a crunch? You know, and that's what my question was. I know these are different departments, so you can only address, like you mentioned, for the police department, but how lean can we run before we start?
I don't think we've established how lean we can run. We can certainly make deeper cuts. These positions represent, though, the positions that are vacant. If you want to run leaner, then that will be layoffs. Or it's kind of the intention that if we get approval from council to run with freezes, and someone leaves employment, then we would include that in our frozen bank, unless it's a critical position, and then we would replace it for someone less salaried than the person that left, because they'd be a new employee. But we would look to add to that throughout the year if anybody leaves. If you want to go leaner now, then that would require us to start evaluating positions for layoffs.
Thank you, Steve. Tim?
Okay. Any questions on this slide? Okay, so the next slide then, after the reduction in personnel costs, is increasing our revenue stream. So I think Steve's covered most of this pretty well, but I'll walk through this. The Love Truck Stop is coming. We're anticipating additional revenues from the motel across the street. Is it La Quinta? Once they're in full operation, that should bring some additional revenues that we've already built into the budget. But what other development is anticipated? How can we attract more businesses to Madera? What needs to be in place for residential development to take place? Do we have opportunities to annex? And what options have we not considered?
So I forgot to mention, I apologize. SBC 20 is likely to appear before voters this November, and that changes your sales tax from point of origin to destination. So those of my family probably could keep City Madera in business for a while. So when you order something, it's taxed on where it gets delivered as opposed to where it gets shipped from.
Or opposed to if it's shipped from out of state, that sales tax might not even be collected because they don't care about what's going on in the other state. But with the approval of this, then it would be collected regardless of what state it's in.
So I can see a pretty significant boost in sales tax relative to that if it passes. A lot of cities are pretty opposed to that. Fresno in particular, which I think the Business Journal pointed out that they only lose $3 million a year, but if they looked at it over 36 years, it's a huge sum of money, but it was only $3 million a year. So it just depends. I think I think it stands a pretty good chance of passing. And for your smaller municipalities, that would be a pretty big boon for a lot of them. Just wanted to throw that out.
Right, and if that does pass, I'm not sure if they'll end up phasing that in. I'm pretty sure they wouldn't do that all at once because that would devastate
2020.
cities like Dinuba. So, okay, so any discussion on this revenue stream? How to improve our revenue stream? Any thoughts how we can attract more development in the city? Are there any options we have not considered?
So one of the questions, Tim, is what has been done with the industrial park that we had out here when it comes to, I think we had something in works with Mr. King, and I'm not sure if that's anything moving along in that arena.
So I wish I could say yes. I wish I could say they're breaking ground. They have agreed to build a spec building, and we're kind of at their mercy, their timeline to make that happen. And quite frankly, I don't know that anything's moved forward with that.
They are moving dirt out.
Old papers.
I was alerted to the fact that dirt was being moved out there today.
Okay. Well, there you go. Good. We don't yet have a tenant for that, but I suspect based upon our lack of vacancy that we'll probably be able to fill that pretty quickly, I would imagine, once they get that up.
I'd also like to share that Mr. Frazier and myself met with a couple of potential investors from other cities in California, as well as Mr. Boyle has met with a couple of people, and so there's some interested people, just not pressing on the gas right away, but not for lack of trying, that's for sure. I check in with Chris usually on a regular basis to see if we've sent another friendly email just to see how things are going. But I think there's people, albeit on the sidelines, they're ready to go in and play, and I think we'll move some more dirt out there very soon. Councilman Oliver.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think City Manager raises an excellent point, as does Councilmember Rodriguez or Mayor Pro Tem Rodriguez. With respect to revenue generation, I mean, that has to be a multi-year effort. It needs to be continuous. I think we need to have a more regular discussion regarding economic development over and beyond what we fund as far as our EDC. I know since you've taken that seat, Steve, that we've looked at the ICSCs, the Select USAs, these really international trade shows and missions to go after and attract new industry. First, you have to start by showing up and telling your story. Do we have some of those activities budgeted as far as this upcoming year's budget?
Yeah, actually, 3 weeks ago, maybe it's been a month now, we went to Vegas and
2 weeks ago.
Is that?
It seems like a month.
Weeks ago, we went and we had several appointments to talk to some individuals. The feeling was weren't real sure that we made any inroads, but we were there, and I think it's the first time that we've been there in probably no less than 15 years. And Select USA is coming in the end of June, and that's an opportunity for us to speak to foreign investors that want to bring their business into the United States. And it is a big affair, and California still has very, very significant allure to those outside the United States. And so we're real optimistic that where we're situated, typically our close proximity to Fresno hurts us because the growth is more centered there, but we get to pull their workforce and Merced's workforce and demonstrate that our dirt is more valuable and more marketable than theirs is, and I'm very optimistic that that we'll have some success there. We're also doing that. There's the three entities in Madera County going. There's Chowchilla, the City of Madera, and the County of Madera. All three working together to go in and market our county. And I think if we get some people interested, we will fly them out here, and then the competition starts, and whether it's Madera City or Madera County or Chowchilla. But it's a really good endeavor for us to do together, and hopefully it'll pay some dividends.
So, but
And again, I think it's the first time we've ever done that.
it is, and I think it's important, and we have to make sure we have an ongoing commitment to it. And I'm just making sure, though, that for this upcoming budget year, that's one of the things that will.
So when you went to Vegas, you went to have them move the Raiders to Madera?
No, in and out.
You know, I would even say that's a good thing, as hard
Yeah.
as that would be to say.
I think what he's really saying is he wants the Raiders to come to Madera.
That's what I told him.
Yeah, yeah. Tim?
Okay,
Continue.
we'll move on. Thank you for all your input on that. These are the recommendations that staff has. Staff's recommended that we move forward with the budget deficit or the budget as being presented or as will be presented at the final budget presentation, implement the soft hiring freeze, identify discretionary positions during fiscal year 18-19 for future reductions, attempt to close the 2.3% gap during the year, dip into reserves for 1 year if the trend changes. There are reserves there for that purpose. If we actually have a deficit in 1 year, which we haven't for a good number of years, we have reserves built up that will cover us at least for that 1 year. Then make the reductions when necessary. So we do have a deficit in a year. Then we realize, hey, this really happens. We need to cut this many positions for the next budget. And then the final recommendation is to promote positive development in Madera, be competitive, and to increase our revenue stream. So we'll get now into the summary of the general fund budgets, and can get into as much detail as you like. And departments can answer any questions you might have on specific budgets. My plan is to present it at a very high level and then answer any questions that you might have come up with during your review of the staff report. So you can see in here that this subtotal here of Fund 1020, there's a reduction of 3% during the year. That's a change in expenditures. That's the bottom right figure there. And you'll notice that I've highlighted Public Works streets. So it's with streets included in the general fund budget, you can see that there's a $1,020,000 reduction in expenditures for that year. So that pretty much explains why there's a decrease in expenditures. It's not that all the other programs went down, but there's less capital projects, less street projects taking place in 18-19. There's so many moving parts that it's hard to keep them all straight, but that's the main reason for that decrease. Other than that, pretty much like Steve said, it's pretty much status quo overall. Then here's the rest of the general fund budgets. Let me go back to this one. You can see that for this section of the Fund 1020, the expenditures exceed revenues by $118,000 for all of those programs and all of the revenues that are related to that fund. Then we have code enforcement. Their expenditures, you can see, are down quite a bit, and they're projecting a $605,000 deficit for the year. In total, that's a $722,000 deficit with those combined. Code enforcement is actually part of the Fund 1020, but we had it broken out historically separately and kind of kept that format, and then we have a new subtotal here to show that. So a $722,000 deficit so far for those. And then we have the CGBG fund, which should balance and comes close to it in the budget at this point.
Tim, I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt, but Councilman Oliver has a question back on the general fund, and so before we continue further, I'm going to ask him to ask his question.
Really quickly, on the city council line item, we have a change of 20%. Just for clarification purposes, would that be for in the event that council seats change, you have new members and different benefit packages? Is that what that would help cover?
Yes.
Okay, so
The short answer is yes. I believe that your budget for Section 125 goes from $65,000-ish up to over $100,000, because when you have new positions coming in, we budget them with as if they'll have family benefits.
Okay.
not knowing if they'll want benefits at all.
And lastly, last year we eliminated or cut in half our travel, our conference budget. Does this budget reflect that decrease as well, or is the 1,700 factored back into there?
I believe we brought it. Sonia, you want to respond to that?
Yes, that's correct. We did bring it back up for 6 of the seats. We have back at the 1,700 allocation, and then 1 seat is at 3,400, and that adds up to the 13,600 that you see on that line item.
Okay.
So the half cut, the reduction is not in there from mid-year.
Okay, thank you.
Well, that is one of the items, one of the actions that helped us balance the budget for the current fiscal year. So, and we have taken quite a few actions during this fiscal year to get to the point that we're at. So then I'll move on to the next slide. In total, and I'll just drop down to the bottom here. In total for 18-19, we're looking at an $845,000 deficit, but there's a $25,000 surplus in Measure K. That's Fund 125. So we can't balance the budget off of that. So we'll add that back in, and that's where we come up with an $870,000 deficit for 18-19. Now, 2 columns over to the left, you'll see that we have the $1.7 million deficit, and we keep saying 1.7 or $911,000. I'll show you the next slide that explains that. But first, let's talk about the 17-18 estimate. So in total, we're projecting at this point, and we're going to do better than this, a $1.4 million surplus, but $1.8 million of that is from surplus in Measure K because we haven't spent the money on the new fire station that's being set aside. PD hasn't expended all their funds. So whatever those numbers are in their projections, they come up short of using the full, it's now projected at $4.4 million, which is a huge jump from the $3.6 million that was originally budgeted.
Awesome.
So yeah, another good example of how we've had a good revenue year. But if you take that, add back that $1.8 million, we're looking at a $383,000 deficit for the current fiscal year. I've been talking with some of the department heads, particularly the police department, and they're aware of some other savings that we haven't reflected in these numbers yet. So we fully anticipate that we'll actually balance the budget for fiscal year 17-18.
So, Tim, was that from that 911,000 deficit?
Yes, I'll get right to that right now. So this is last year's budget, general fund budget presentation. There's 1.7. There's about a $10,000 difference. I don't know what that is at this point, but the $1.7 million deficit is where we started, and then we said, well, that's not really an operational deficit. So if you back out the capital outlay, such as the new ERP system costs, and I think it was I want to say fire truck also, but for the costs on that. Is that correct, Susan? Fire truck and ERP? Okay.
Nobody can.
Okay. Oh, come on now.
I can't see it. I'm sitting right here.
Okay. So anyway, we said if you back those out, then our operational deficit basically is $1.3 million. And then we said, okay, we're going to balance that even further by utilizing the revenues that were not anticipated last fiscal year in Measure K. $400,000 of that we're going to overspend the budgets for police and fire, and that'll bring the deficit down to $911,000. Then I even took it a step further last year. I should say we took it a step further last year by saying, okay, we're looking at a $911,000 deficit. We're not just going to let that ride. We're going to find ways during the year to cut that. And if we end up right at zero at the end of the fiscal year, that's going to be a miracle. But we worked hard, and we had a plan to cut the costs, and we've cut the costs this year. But at the same time, was it just luck because we had 13 vacant positions? I guess it's all how you look at it. So this is where we'll take luck every time, exactly. So these are the $1.4 million, $1.7 million figure, the 1.3, and the $911,000 deficits that were discussed last year. So really, we were only anticipating the $911,000 deficit, and we were going to wipe that all away. Okay, And Steve may have some comments on this, but this portrays the breakdown of all the general fund expenditures. As he mentioned earlier, 53% of that is public safety. The next biggest one, it looks like community development at 9.7%.
Parks.
Where is Parks and Rec? Oh, 11.6%. Sorry. Yeah, and then there's a lot of divisions, a lot of activities, a lot of programs within that program as well. So, Steve, did you have any further comments on this?
No, I brought this up earlier just to kind of demonstrate that if we were going to look to cut positions, it would make sense to cut fire. Actually, 53% is limited because we are bound to contract with fire, and so that really limits our ability even further to.
Mayor, if I could interrupt and have Steve turn his mic on when he speaks and speak closer to the mic. Thank you.
Yeah, I have to say that joke again.
All right.
Say it again.
Yeah.
I don't know what I said.
Okay, so I think this is a good picture to look at, very informational. You can see how much each division, each department uses of the general fund budget. And if we're limited, we can't touch this, I mean, then further reductions in any of these is going to be a pretty significant impact on those. And on behalf of Parks and Recreations, if you'll go back and look at their specific budgets, you'll see that there were some very sizable reductions in their budget from last year to this year. Okay, and this is another schedule that's included in the budget. Shows what the impact of each department is. We have a line item here for unassigned revenues that are not assigned to a department, non-departmental revenues. That's basically our taxes. And then you have your other non-departmental revenues below that, I'm sorry. Notice that building inspection actually brings in a little bit more money than they expend, but really building and planning work together. Anything that goes to building is fed to them through planning, so those two pretty much offset each other, leave about $100,000 of appropriation as compared to contributions to the fund balance. Any questions on that slide? Give you a moment to look it over just to make sure. And this slide will be included in the final budget. I believe that's Exhibit A in the budget, and the other departments that are non-general fund are also included in this schedule. It's basically a summary of all of our revenues and expenditures. Okay, so we've discussed the general fund, and that was.
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm looking at it, and I don't know what brought my attention is. Where it has city council, revenues is $27,000, then the expenditures are $184,000, and then appropriation budget is $156,000.
Right. So what that is if basically you're adding these numbers across. These are your revenues, and that comes from admin and overhead allocation because we allocate the cost out to the non-general fund departments because this cost is needed to run the city, and they're part of the cost to run the city. So that's where the revenue comes from. On the expenditure side, that's the costs that are in the city council's budget for your Section 125, for your stipend, and the small amounts that are included in that. All of budget for all of the city council adds up to 184. So this is the difference between the revenues and expenditures. So it costs the general fund $157,000 to fund the city council budget. I should say the numbers that are in the budget would cost the city $157,000 because it's likely that the Section 125 cost won't go as high as budgeted, but we budget for that possibility. Does that make sense, Donald?
I ain't got it yet.
So this is your revenue.
Yes.
That's a plus. these are your expenditures, that's a minus, but they end up in a plus over here somehow. It's just the way we do it. We do the revenues as a credit, expenditures as a debit, and the debit over here is your the net cost after income for the city council. Any further questions?
Not yet.
Okay. And I'd be glad to discuss that with you at any time outside of city council as well. Okay, so that basically wraps up the general fund. Unless we'd like to make the decisions at this point, do you want to go with staff's recommendations? Do you want to further discuss filling some of those vacant positions? Do you want to look at cutting positions for the upcoming budget? Or move forward with the final budget for the general fund, at least, as presented, with any changes that will come between now and the 20th of June, or whenever we present that final budget.
Mr. Councilman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First, I just wanted to extend some comments, and thanks to you, Tim, as well as Steve and your staffs and all of our departments and everybody who had a hand, especially on the general fund budget. What I've shared with people is I look at this budget as our first budget. I think that we're dealing off the top of the deck, and I appreciate you laying out a lot of different options at the onset. I think that this is long overdue. I've expressed some frustration in previous years as to how we've approached our budget making, and as far as forecasted deficits and coming back with in the black surpluses and building up our general fund reserve coffers. And so I really think that this is a good, honest approach, and so I thank you for your efforts. Just some initial thoughts. I'm good with some of the recommendations here. One thing I'd like for us as a council to look at is to revisit our budget reserve policy, because as you had mentioned, our 30% set aside calls for about $11.8 million. We're currently sitting close to 14, so we have a difference of about $2.5 million, and we really haven't assigned those dollars when we've had that difference in previous budget years. And I know that in our budget policy, we call for some flexibility there, whether they be non-recurring funds or expenses, maybe some one-time monies for critical capital projects. I think that's something that we should look at. And at minimum, I think it's maybe we look at kind of a contingency in the event that, there's some swings in the economy, maybe some revenues that don't reach our expectations, so that we at least have that, $2.5 million buffer to absorb some of those costs. So I think that's a discussion we should have as far as being more proactive in how to utilize those dollars. Maybe it's in economic development and looking at, business recruitment and as far as revenue generation. And then second, I would like to see us continue with, cutting our travel and conference budget, starting with City Council. I think it's obviously not going to make a large dent in the overall budget picture, but I think in principle it's a good practice for this council. So that's a recommendation I would have in moving forward. And so I know that we have factored in the $1,700 amount for 6 of our members. So I'd recommend looking at maybe cutting that in half as we did in last year's budget.
Mr. Mayor and council members, I would just want to, I appreciate that very much, but I want to throw out, based kind of on our new approach of economic development and being more engaged in that process, there's an opportunity for council to be engaged in that process as well. So I would ask that you maybe keep your training budget whole, so that when those opportunities to go to, had we been maybe a little more aware, maybe Select USA, because I know that Chowchilla is taking a council member, or to I can never get the
ICSC.
Yeah, that one. So there's benefit in having political representatives there, the clout and the things that you can bring to those. Not only is there one in Vegas, but they have one in Monterey that is that's a California version of that. I think there's value in having council members participate in that.
I agree 100%. Maybe it's a separate then line item for job generation and economic development. Quite frankly, if I were to go to a League of Cities policy conference, and go over my budget, I hate to say it, but I'm probably not going to bring back a lot of leads to the city. Then if I were to go to international conference of shopping centers in Monterey, I agree. I think that's more valuable. But so I think it's a point to discuss. I think in principle it's a good approach, but those are just my initial thoughts.
I appreciate that, Mr. Councilman. Any other thoughts or discussions about the recommendations we have before us? Not that it's necessarily set in stone. If council feels a little more comfortable going through some of the other budgets and coming back to this, but we can certainly discuss it right now. Mayor Pro Tem Rodriguez.
Yes, thank you, Member Dillon. The question that I have is, that we still have a comp study out, and I don't know when we will have a report presented. Don't know if it was a good idea to have that also in front of us so that we can help make decisions when it comes to this. So, this way we get to know really what's out there. And I just wanted to ask the question if that's something that could potentially work into this budget if we do get it maybe a month later, a couple months back. I mean, just looking out, I don't know when we're expecting to have the report so that, the council can then digest that and see what we can bring back to this budget.
Certainly those things can be factored into the budget. We could even go so far as to make a prediction if council so choose to go that path. But whenever that study's done and whatever decision that council makes, that money will always be factored into the budget, either positive or negatively. That's not a problem.
Yeah, and I know it might not, when I bring it up, it might not sit well, but, I just thought that if the council has a report of that, then we can kind of see beyond that and move forward. I mean, I think that would put some closure to this, item that has been brought before us.
Yeah, it's kind of our desire to bring a budget item back at the next council meeting. I think it might be a little ambitious to have, or for council to have a decision relative to those salaries by then. But again, any move, positive or negative, that you make, whether it be negotiations with the bargaining group, whether it be based upon your comp study, all those things have an impact on our budget, positive and or negative. So we'll be able to factor that in.
Good. Well, thank you. Appreciate that.
Tim, can you go back to those recommendations after the... Yeah, thank you. I'll try to be brief, but I think I'm better off saying my comments now rather than waiting till the end. But I concur with what my colleagues are saying, and a lot of it is a crystal ball. A lot of what we do is a crystal ball. In my business and at the city, there's the unknowns. We don't have a set revenue stream that is guaranteed every month, and we don't have a set expenditure that we know solidly every month that that's what it's going to be. And so we do things like we forecast or we estimate. And so it's very, very difficult to run a business that way. And so you do rely on luck sometimes at the final month, kind of where we are right now. But I will say this, with all due respect, because it's been said in the past, and I agree, I think we get lucky at times. But I also want to say that this council has made some very difficult yet necessary decisions. And the wheels of government move slow. They really, really do. And even though we haven't seen a nickel from the Loves Travel Center, initial meetings started years ago. The casino has been in litigation for 12 plus years. When we started Freedom Industrial Park, that was years ago, mapping that out, and fighting people saying we should have multifamily there or apartments and things like that. And we knew the value of what that can bring the city of Madera. And so we brought in somebody from Fresno, and it was great, and we're going to continue with that. So my point is I think we've made some very good decisions over the last 3 to 5 years to keep us where we are. When we battle PERS and we battled Prop 13 and the loss of RDA, which was huge for Madera. I mean, we were one of the first ones to be audited, I think the fourth in the state to be audited at RDA, and we basically came out with a perfect bill of health. We were using the money what it was supposed to be used for, and we really changed the face of Madera, and that carpet was pulled out from under us. But I think we really met those things head on. I think we dealt with it. I think a lot of the things that happened in Sacramento and in Washington, D.C., we've had to deal with it. And now, before we even start July 1, we're minus $750,000 with predictions and unknowns and things of that nature. So sometimes it's easy to compare ourselves to other cities and with what they're doing, and they're in the same red tape we are in. I get that, but they're not Madera. And where other cities are $1 million plus in the hole, I think we could have, if we didn't make some of the necessary adjustments over the last few years, I think we could have been certainly in that red $2.5 million easily could have happened for the city of Madera. So I personally like the recommendations that are here. I think we are in a unique position in that those 10 positions that you showed earlier, Tim, that they're vacant. We don't have to look somebody in the face and say we have to make those serious cuts. Do we need those police officers? Absolutely. Do we need code enforcement? Yes. We approved unanimously a rental inspection program that, by all estimates at the time, was supposed to be $500,000 plus in revenue. And so we're at a catch-22. In order to have that revenue, we need more bodies. But if we don't have the bodies, then we don't have the revenue. So, you know, it's the chicken or the egg kind of thing. And we need to address that. We had a discussion not long ago with our Parks Director in the 4th of July celebration. It wasn't just the dollar amount, but the bodies that we don't have to do that. So even if this council said, let's do it, I think the feeling I got from our Parks Director was it takes a lot of manpower, and we had a very, very important position or positions that are no longer with the Parks Department. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we're not in an easy position. And we were elected to make the tough, difficult decisions and represent our community, and that's what's before us now. But I think it could have been a whole lot worse. I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that things change rapidly. I like, Tim, that you brought a mid-year budget to us, and I appreciate staff coming to us with, again, those predictions, but always knowing that there could be the unknown, that we could have a curveball. So I agree with Councilman Oliver. I think we need to not just wait for once every 6 months, but constantly finding those opportunities on where we could help Madera grow. Again, in my business, you can only save so much. And the M&O cuts that we've done, there's nothing more to save. We have to make money. That's the bottom line. We have to make money. We have to have those discussions. And as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing off the table. With all due respect, Mayor Pro Tem, I know there's been discussions of cannabis and possibly cultivation and distribution, and I think we may have to visit that. I think we need to do anything, we owe it to the city to do anything and everything we can to raise those dollars. Again, knowing that even if a decision was made, it doesn't happen tomorrow. So I like these recommendations you have before us. I'm not saying I'm making a motion or anything. The last thing I want to do is contract out, which is what we're doing in some of our departments. But we also have to be aware of the fact that it's not just salary, but it's salary and benefits. So I think with what you have before us is probably the prudent way to go, and understand that we could, as time goes on, look at those positions and see what the need is. And we can certainly make amendments to the budget as we go. That's all I have to say.
Tim, really quick, did I miss it? Or, I mean, there's a lot of what I'm being told is what we're predicting, and you know, our tax revenue stream is obviously unpredictable, but you guys always come up with a number. Did we consider our possible change in our diffs? I know we have a study that's out there that's supposed to be coming back to us at the end of June. Did we take into consideration that could possibly change? Or
No, I haven't seen any sign of where that's going to be headed, so I have no idea how we would implement that into the budget. I know David Merchant's working on that, but Green.
I missed the button. Yeah, that will, we do anticipate that being back end of June, 1st of July. There will obviously be some pretty significant changes, but not necessarily that will be a huge impact to the general fund.
Okay.
We will see those and wish that we had had them for a number of years in advance, because what lags is our ability to keep up with our infrastructure needs and everything else, and raising these diff rates will allow us to focus on that, will allow us to utilize the Quimby Act that we now have in place that otherwise we wouldn't have general fund money to deal with that. And those diff fees going to parks and being able to spend those to improve our community, yeah, we see great opportunity with that, but not necessarily an offset for the general fund.
And I understand that, and I think what I'm trying to do is piggyback off of something that was alluded to us by the mayor, that this is a process, and that we're, even though we're here tonight to perhaps maybe close this gap as quickly as possible, and you know, if I had that 4-leaf clover and that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, I'd be as happy too. But I think that what I'm trying to do is answer, there was a question that Tim had proposed on one of his slides, other revenue streams. And I think that that's something that we need to remind ourselves as a council, that there is an opportunity to maybe set ourselves up 30 years down the road to where hopefully whoever's sitting in this chair then will be able to not have to make these tough decisions as implied by the mayor that we're having to make time and time again seemingly from the dais.
And I can just, and I don't know if it was just, you know, when I came into this position, I was going to bring businesses in.
You still can.
Just shows you how little I know that process doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
It is, my wife ordered me to bring in In-N-Out Burger, and I still don't have that. I'm barely married right now because I haven't accomplished that. But it is a process, and it is not one that any one person can make happen by snapping their fingers or whipping the 4-leaf clover out.
Right.
I wish it was, because we wouldn't have a revenue problem. But again, at council's direction, we'll be diligent in moving those things forward.
I'm not interested, Mr. Mayor, in talking about the reduction of services yet, nor am I interested in talking about the reduction of positions. However, I can take some of staff's recommendations and move forward with several of them. But that's just my personal stance.
I appreciate that. Councilman Oliver.
Well, quickly, Mr. Mayor, Steve, we discussed, I think at a couple of meetings ago, the possibility of bringing back a budget resolution pertaining to Measure K, and seeing that we, you know, commit ourselves to those dollars, at least a half-cent worth towards public safety. Where are we on that, and are we anticipating introducing that before this upcoming budget?
Yeah, actually, that was on tomorrow's agenda for a brief time, and then Tim got kind of buried in budget, and so we will look to bring that back at the next council meeting. Tim, correct?
Correct.
So we should have that on the 20th for council review and a decision on how we move that forward.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments for Tim or staff?
Okay, thank you all for all of those comments. Much appreciated. So, get back to the enterprise budgets here.
So there's 150 pages here. Yeah. I am on good. I don't know if these are enterprise funds. These are funds that are paid for outside of general fund money. I don't know how much detail council needs at this point. Tim presented these preliminary budgets early on, you know, throughout the last 2 to 3 months. As much as I enjoy hearing Tim's presentation, I'm not sure 150 pages worth. So if there's some direction, that if there's something specific that you want to talk about, If you want to go through each one, each page, we can certainly do that. But if you want to weigh in and maybe let Tim know if there's some abbreviated approach that we can take.
I would appreciate if Tim maybe went into more about the 12% rate increase. I know that that's kind of something we've already talked about, but I'd love to see sort of how that's going to be phased in to the ratepayer, please, knowing that we're kind of coming off the heels of some water stuff, and I just really kind of want to make sure I've got my head wrapped around what my consumer can expect over the next several years.
This is solid waste.
Solid waste, I'm
Yes,
sorry,
specific
yes,
solid
yeah,
waste.
I'm sorry, yeah.
Okay.
So, I've been known for my brevity, so I'll try to exercise my strengths in brevity tonight. I'll walk through these summaries and explain that 12% rate increase when we get there. But this is a summary of the enterprise budgets. In total, all the major enterprise budgets are looking at a $643,000 or 2.2% combined surplus in 1819, with $4.3 million of capital outlay. No new positions are being requested. Solid waste manager, in fact, position has been eliminated. The solid waste fund is showing a deficit of $632,000. That would require a 12% rate increase to be balanced if we were planning on balancing that. And I'll cover that in a little bit more detail shortly.
Thank you.
And the drainage...
Let me weigh in on that just real quick, and I think I can probably do it faster than you.
Doubt it.
So when Tim presented the solid waste budget to you a month ago, I saw the deficit, and I said no self-respecting finance manager would go
That's
in
what
front
he
of
said,
council
too. Yep.
and have that kind of deficit without a plan to erase it. And being a good soldier, he said, okay. And so that's the 12% that you see there. But the reality is it's been relatively superfunded and remains that way for at least 2, maybe 3 more years. So this is a byproduct of my question to Tim and Tim responding to that, but nothing will likely have to be done for probably 3 years relative to that. We do have an agreement with solid waste in year 5 that we would renew. We would look at those fees, and I'm not sure if we're in year 5 next year or not. So there may be a review of those, but we're still sitting on a $2.5 million.
That's correct.
Reserve. So your constituents probably won't see an increase in that for a bit. Did that help clarify that?
For now.
So
Yes.
this is the next slide, and Public Works actually provided this correction to the 2 paragraphs that I had in my staff report. It does mention right in here that there's a projected working capital balance of $2.5 million. And John, I'm correct that that's at the end of 1819, correct? 2.5, because I know at the end of 1617 there's like a $3.7 million balance.
Yeah, that should be the end of 1819.
Okay, good answer. So he also talks about when the rates were set 5 years ago, there's a high fund balance. It's in excess of the goal of they say the goal of 20 to 30%. And even at the end of the fiscal year 1819, they're projecting to have a 37% fund balance. So that was kind of a decision that was made by council back then to use down the balance without increasing the rates to users. And they had some small correction on the drainage fund as well. But all of these exhibits are in your staff report. The total major enterprise funds, as I mentioned, $690,000 surplus. We have a $640,000 deficit. You can see the far right in sewer. Solid waste, we just mentioned, has a $632,000 deficit. The water fund, on the other hand, is showing a $2.0 million surplus. Councilmember Hawley asked me if we've already received the response from Raftellus and whether we know if we're going to be able to hold back on rate increases or not. We don't have that back from Raftellus. We're hoping to get that by the end of June. So we're not incorporating any rate reductions or or changing our planned increases at this point. In other words, the water budget is based on the rate increase that was scheduled from the water rate study. Questions?
So I'm sorry, Tim, are you saying that we're utilizing the same rate that we used for last year's fiscal budget?
No. So there was, I believe there's a 10% increase for 18-19 for the water funds, the water rates,
For
and that's
solid
included
waste.
in this increase.
It's water.
Oh, he was
Water.
talking water, okay,
Water.
That's water.
yeah.
So at this point, what I'm trying to say is there may be a reduction in the rates, but at this point, we're getting so close to the next fiscal year that we're just going to have to advertise that the rates are going to increase as scheduled with the 10% increase. And then if we find out from Raftellus that we can cut it back, then we'll cut it back. We can always cut back.
Yeah.
So Raftellus is doing a study. We'll bring that study to council. Council will have a decision point on whether they stay with implementation that has a 10% increase this year, another factored in increase next year, or whether that study reflects that you will bring in enough revenue to do the projects that we have planned for those studies. Sorry. So it will be a council decision point on that study on what they want to do. When they were here, if you recall, we had talked about reducing our incentives relative to conservation, cutting that in half potentially. That's $500,000. I think everybody at that time thought that there might be a positive impact when you factor those in. Raftellus is looking at that, and they'll be able to present that report to you, and council will make a decision on the direction they want to go once that report is received.
Yeah, the point that I just wanted to make clear that this budget assumes that the scheduled rate increases.
Yeah.
Could we not hold back maybe the rate increase until? I'm just curious, what's the difference between us saying, time out, let's keep it the way it is, and then once we get this study, we'll determine whether or not we're going to raise it?
So we can certainly hold off on that increase. I don't know when, I don't know if that's a July 1 trigger on that, is it?
Have notices going?
Well, so when we did the rate study, we incorporated the rates. They became effective in August when these last scheduled rates took place. So we could look at the possibility of postponing it until we have a response to that.
I would be more amenable to that probably than implementing an increase, then coming back, then maybe taking it away, or maybe adding to it. I'd rather let's keep it where it's at. And I don't know if this is in the form of a motion. This is just discussion. My personal feeling is to just keep it where it's at until we get all the numbers in front of us, and then this council can make the decision that they feel is best well-served to make sure that our projects are funded and that we're moving forward the way we've desired to ensure safe water and water storage moving forward.
We'll look to do that. If we run into any problems, we'll come back and see what direction you want to go.
I don't know. I don't want to speak on behalf of the
No,
council.
I think it's
just
I think it's a
my
very good
personal.
point.
I think that's prudent.
So what we can do as far as budget preparations, we could come back with the budget with no increase, or maybe with the 10% increase, or if Raftellus tells us we only need a 7% increase before then, we can bring both options for council to approve, or we can just come back with one, depending on the city administrator's direction on holding off until those rate increases take place. But we would have to, again, recalculate our revenues and see how that'll change the budget. Okay?
I agree. But that was
your
had
point?
the same question,
Okay.
comment, so
Great.
I would agree.
Seems to be a consensus on that.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so then here's the rest of the enterprise funds. In total, it's a $744,000 surplus. With some funds having deficits and some having surpluses. I think that there's some corrections yet to be made in the dial-a-ride and fixed routes because those should balance out, but we'll have that fixed by the final budget presentation. So then the next one is the internal service budgets, and I'll just cover that real quick because that's a short one. The projected deficit for that is $45,000. And the reason for that is we're spending more on vehicles than we're collecting in 2018, 2019, and that happens just because we have so many vehicles to be replaced over time, and we replace those when they come due. So we build up enough money to replace them when it's necessary. Some years we spend more, some years we bring in more. I think we covered that pretty well in the preliminary budget presentation as well.
Tim, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
You know, when it comes to technology, I noticed that you guys I noticed that you're placing a certain amount of money for computers and what have you. And that's for replacement, I'm assuming. But the amount that was collected for these computers, I noticed it was somewhere in the $8,000 per. I'm not sure if that was.
That fluctuates greatly between departments.
Okay, so that's what I was going to ask is, and might I ask why so high on that, as far as?
Right. So we've established a schedule both in IT now and in fleet, where we have all this computer equipment that needs to be replaced at a certain time. We know the cost of those, so we've set aside money to replace that when it comes time to replace those computers, those servers, whatever the equipment is. So you have both the maintenance aspect and the equipment replacement aspect. You can see both those two lines. It's actually two separate funds for those. I'm sorry, there are two different lines in the budget itself, but under technology, they're combined here. But you set those monies aside. He has specific equipment to be replaced, and each one is scheduled to be replaced, and dollars are set aside for that. In the past, those monies weren't set aside, so a lot of times the budget dollars weren't there, so we suffered. The IT of the city was suffered, basically, because there weren't, comes to a time we need to cut budgets, and the money's not there, then you're dealing with a 9-year-old computer that's creating problems and more maintenance by the IT division. But let me let Mark respond to that. He is the IT director, and he can answer any specific questions you might have about that.
Council members, Mayor, yes, the computers are broken out on a schedule. So we allocate all of our costs based upon computer. Our costs includes personnel, our costs include replacements, software licensing. So it's not just
hardware.
It's not just the hardware. Hardware's probably about 10 to 20% of that, whereas a lot of it is going to be into Microsoft licensing, maintenance for Munis, staff time, personnel, things like that.
So it's I kind of figured that. I just didn't think that 8,000 would be just allocation to the hardware, but there was other factors in there as well.
That's correct, and also we're also including servers in there as too. So people use servers, and it's hard to allocate a server. So we're doing it based on PC accessing that server. That way we can spread the costs across all departments equally.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
As a line item, it looked really expensive for a computer, didn't it? Yeah, $8,000 computer.
A lot of money.
Oh, that's a good question.
And this year there was some real fluctuation between the different departments' budgets. One of the things that Mark changed was, as he mentioned, it's allocation per server. So, but there were a good number of, I said per computer. There were a good number of computers that were in labs that really weren't being used on a daily basis. And somehow the costs were being allocated to those as well. So he pulled those out of the allocation, which shifted costs around quite a bit. I think the biggest impact was probably on the Parks and Recs budget, which came down quite a bit from last year because they had quite a few computers in their lab that were not maintained, that were not used by employees on a daily basis.
Yes, we're reusing hardware. So in computer labs and some servers, for example, we can take a high-end server after 4 years of its lifetime, repurpose it to something that's still server class, but it's going to be not as intensive. So we can get another 3-4 years out of it. Same with computer labs. We can take a desktop computer that's 3-4 years of its life, add some more memory to it, and then make it a lab computer for people to use. And therefore, I don't need to replace that because I can just repurpose it. And then I can also lock it down, so the staff time is minimal. Once we get it set up, we lock it down, and it just stays that way for a year. They turn it off, turn it back on, and it comes back to the way it was before. So there's really no there's not a lot of staff time for that, so it helps with repurposing to take that out of the general fund budget.
I have to say that Mark's done a real good job of cutting costs for us. Not only that, but he's found a way to increase revenues for us by looking at the possibility of is it a cell phone tower or some kind of a tower was it cell phone?
Yes, we're currently working on a deal right now with AT&T locating antennas on the water tower. And once we get the contract finalized, we'll bring it to council for their approval.
Great.
Another way that we've been looking at increasing revenues, council knows that we've been refinancing bonds to come in with lower debt service costs, but also that turns into revenue when we work with the redevelopment agency, and Bob's been working to refund those bonds, and that could bring in an additional $100,000 plus per year for the city in revenues as far as property taxes. So it's kind of coming back to that point. This is the section of the special revenue budgets. There's a lot of them in there. In fact, there's 80 budgets, just their landscape maintenance districts. I have to point out that those budgets have not been updated yet, but our plan is to have those completed by the final budget presentation. And those are a lot of small budgets that take a lot of work to fine-tune and figure out how much cost is allocated to them and how much we can charge, and then decide whether we can increase the rates to those, which ones are legal to increase, which ones we have to take out to a Prop 218 process. That's just the last 80 budgets that you'll see in the budget when you see the final budget document. But the main points here are, these special revenues are restricted for special purposes. We're expecting $3 million more of expenses than revenue, again, primarily because of capital projects, and when you do the projects, when you've built up the funds, so that's what's going on here. $2.4 million roughly is going into streets in the general fund. You remember the line items that I showed you, that it dropped $1 million from last year. Basically dropped from 3.4 to $2.4 million. But those revenues are coming into the general fund. They're transferring in from gas tax and Measure T, other special revenue funding sources. I'm not going to go through these. These are generally of least concern because they're primarily capital projects. There is some personnel costs included in the streets for this and in the grants department, but be glad to answer any questions that council or anyone might have on the special revenues budgets. Otherwise, I'm ready to wrap it up if council is ready to, because we've discussed the general fund budget. We'll incorporate the recommendations that council's made into the final budget. Then we discussed all the other budgets, albeit briefly, and we plan to come back to council for approval of the City of Madera 18-19 budget at the June 20th meeting. Notice I say plan to, just in case it doesn't all work out perfectly or too many changes come to fruition between then. But at this point, I'd be glad to answer any further questions or direction from council.
Tim, can you go back to those last budgets?
The special revenue budgets?
More specifically, is the budget we had, either used to have or maybe we still have, the 50/50 line item budget we did for sidewalk and sidewalk repair. Do we still have that implemented? That
would be in this. So sidewalk repair would definitely be in the street maintenance budget. Keith, do you have any comments on that, or John?
I can make a comment. It's still available for use, but what it does is it comes out of one of the sources of the local transportation funds.
That's what I thought.
So, yeah, I got it. So it is available. The local transportation funds that represents a good source of that. As long as the 50/50 as long as there's not a lot of demand on that particular program, LTF can continue to sustain that for a little while.
Well, I know us as a council, as well as the MCTC, we're really working hard to increase walkability, bike paths, transportation, things of that nature. And I know we used to have, and we were very active in letting the community know about our 50/50 sidewalk program. And I don't think we've done that as well as we should. And I wasn't sure if it was because of budgetary reasons or not. But but I would like to. I would like to let the community know, since there are a number of sidewalks that are in disarray and need assistance. And so as we inform the community about water rates or other issues, I'd like to be a little more aggressive in that. And because I personally have had people ask me, one, they think the responsibility is the city, but I think if they understand that there's a 50-50 program and they're willing to pay half, they're certainly willing to do so.
Sure. I'm not sure that there's, Public Works may be better to answer this, but I'm not sure there's been a lot of outreach with regard to the 50-50 program. People usually learn of it after they've been cited for a problem. Somebody trips on a sidewalk, they make a report, and
Exactly.
and it's brought to the Public Works Department. The sidewalk's inspected, determined what amount of the sidewalk needs to be replaced,
Right.
and the 50-50 program is offered. And then you start talking about whether it's more beneficial for them to use the 50-50 or to just go ahead and do it themselves using another contractor.
I get that, and thank you for that answer. I personally, I'd like to be a little more proactive on what we can do for the community. Rather than get a letter that says fix it or else, I want to be a little more proactive and say we have identified some areas of the city that certainly need some assistance, and we're going to do so. There's even some areas without sidewalk. It's really odd. I think on South A Street, there's a few homes with a sidewalk and then nothing at all, and then we have a rehab center. So I won't get too deep into it, but just like our water conservation, I think we made a fairly decent effort to let people know there are some conservation dollars, but I don't think we were very aggressive. But I can talk to you about it later, or Public Works, and being aggressive
That'd be
again with this.
great. Right now, I'd characterize it as a token amount within LTF. Sidewalks can get to be fairly expensive, so
Sure.
we would be needing to talk about that.
Thank you very much, Keith. I appreciate that. Any other questions or comments as we, it looks like this is the wrap it up thank you. Is that what that is, Tim?
Yes. Thank you.
Well,
I just want to thank council for the work that you've helped us with during the budget preparations thus far. All the departments have been brilliant to work with. Eric and Susan have been really my backbone for this and really helped me out a lot. So I appreciate everybody's participation, and I think we've had a successful budget preparation year thus far.
A lot of work, obviously a lot of work has gone into it. So I too want to thank staff and our team and Steve Frazier and everybody all the way down the line, all the employees of the city of Madera for being patient. This isn't something that we've done over the last week or two. It's really kind of, it's a year-long process, really. It's not recent. And Tim, you've had a lot of great informative budget discussions over the last 3 months to really kind of break it down into the different departments, and that's really helped. But as I mentioned before, it's not easy to make some of the tough decisions. But I think we've all kind of had that reoccurring theme in that as far as economic development, as far as what we've been trying to do to raise revenue, we haven't been as successful as we want to be. And so maybe it's time to think outside the box. Maybe it's time to turn the road or do something different. And so going to some conferences that we hadn't gone before and really being proactive with some of those companies that may or may not move to Madera, we need to go out there and be aggressive. That is, I feel, as council, that is our role and responsibility, is to go out there and beat the bushes and bring in as much revenue as we can as possible. Whether it's retail market or commercial market or the housing market, that is our role and responsibility. So I take that on personally. I think we need to be more aggressive in the way we approach this issue. This is not for just budget time to say so, but for 52 weeks out of the year, this is something that really needs to be our new theme in what we do. So I want to thank staff for taking all my calls with budget, which has been a number of them, and I appreciate what you do to really keep us on track. This is your full-time job, and it's certainly not an easy one. And there is no quick fix. There is no one answer. There is no snapping of the fingers, and that's a great idea, and let's have In-N-Out here tomorrow, because if that was the case, we'd probably have half a dozen of them here in the city of Madera. But that doesn't mean we're going to give up. And that doesn't mean that we're going to continue to hide behind that there's just no money there, because honestly, in my 7 years as a council member, I'm tired of saying there's just no money there. Because with that, I need to say, but we're going to do something to raise that money. So I'm not sure, Mr. Frazier, if my colleagues have anything else to add before we wrap it up. Please do so.
So I'm not sure that we have a consensus on the direction we're going to go. Are you good with the recommendations? Do you have some other input or some other avenue that you'd like us to pursue?
Well, for me, Councilman Rigby hit the nail on the head. I think not every single one of those recommendations. I don't think. Well, I don't want to speak for you, Mr. Rigby, but I think identifying some of those positions is not something that we want to do at this point. Can we put that slide back on there, Tim? Those general fund recommendations.
Right, and the recommendation wasn't necessarily to cut positions at this time, but to identify positions that may be discretionary for future eliminations, and that even brought up the possibility of doing that through attrition. Do you do that through attrition, or do you do that through layoffs? Is this the slide you're talking about?
Or do you want to go back to the
No,
10?
the other one.
No.
The
The
freeze
other one.
positions.
No.
This one right here.
The identified discretionary positions for future reductions.
And to Mayor Pro Tem's point, we are still in negotiations. We still have a salary survey, if you will, and so that it may not be prudent to do that just yet. But as far as implementing that soft hiring freeze, and again, I'm speaking for myself, I'm not speaking for the council, of these positions that have not been filled as of yet, I'm okay with that. Councilman Oliver, you have some comments.
I'm good with that too, Mr. Mayor, and I think moving forward now, once we adopt a budget in the next month or so, I think what we ought to do as well is, and again, this is a multi-year effort, but we have to take a department-by-department zero-based approach at least every couple of years. And I'd like to see recommendations from, whether it be inline staff or department heads as to what some of those positions may look like after taking that deep dive. And I think that kind of goes into our change in approach as far as budget making. So there's a point I wanted to make earlier, but I think that's something that we need to seriously look at as well, not only in the upcoming budget year, but in years to come.
Mm-hmm. Councilmember Rigby, the idea is that we have the choice of staffing by default or by accident, by just leaving positions vacant that are vacant, or saying, these positions are critical, so these positions we would identify and say, these, if we're to cut positions, we probably don't need this position, we need it less than this. It's not that we don't need any of the positions that we have. All the positions that we have are important and do an important service for the city, but if you're limited in the funds, then you would prioritize those positions potentially. But staff isn't recommending that you cut positions during the fiscal year. We're recommending freezing those positions that are vacant and attempting to balance the budget during the year, not by cutting positions, but through further vacancies or other savings that we can realize, or hopefully higher revenues.
And I'm tracking Mr. Presbila totally, and I think I'm going to lean heavily on department heads because I trust them. I trust that they understand what it takes in order to deliver the services at the quality at which we deliver them at the City of Madera. And if there's a way that they can begin to, make sure that those options are made available to us throughout the year, maybe during the mid-year budget review, I'm good with that. But that's all I'm saying. I can value the Public Works Department being able to bring to us the opportunity to partner with the waste management group that we're partnered with, to be able to alleviate some of the positions or actually just make better the service that we provide. And that's what I'm looking for. That's the kind of leadership that I'm looking for from department heads, are opportunities to make services that we can provide better. And if that means that we come back to this discussion, then so be it. But that's kind of the direction that I'm trying to take with this.
Perfect. Thank you.
If I can, Mr. Mayor and Council, just to kind of reinforce what the Mayor said, order of magnitude, if we can't improve our revenue, you're looking at 20 positions being laid off. there's no way for us to improve our service delivery with those kind of cuts.
And I understand, and I'm willing to work to find.
So I just as kind of an order of magnitude, it's an imperative that we find some way to bring in revenue for this city.
Mm-hmm.
Because the alternative, like I mentioned at the beginning of this, the alternative is that we have to make cuts so deep that our service delivery will be hugely impacted.
It'll suffer. Well, to that last point, promote positive development in Madera to increase our revenue stream. That's first and foremost. That's what we'll follow. That's the path that we'll follow, and we'll continue to do so.
I think we got it now. Thank you.
Did we want to discuss what was brought up earlier by Councilmember Oliver? I think he had made a discussion point about reducing the council's travel and conference budget.
I did.
Is that something my colleagues are willing to discuss, or?
I would like to bring that back just for point of clarification, because in speaking with Sonia, I think what she had done for the 18-19 budget is put back our original travel expense fund. So even though months ago we reduced it in half, I want to have that discussion about, are we going to continue with that? Or how are we going to spend those funds, and what steps are we going to take as leadership in our community to show that it starts with us? Councilman Oliver.
Mr. Mayor, I mean, I think it would be prudent for us to do so, consistent with last year. I think the budget savings would be nominal, but perhaps what we could do with those savings, if Steve and staff want to bring back, let's say, a economic development or job generation line item, if a council member wanted to go and attend a ICSC or Select USA, let's justify it with the purposes of going out and recruiting new industry. So perhaps we can approach it that way, but I would be amenable to cutting that budget. I think that would be about $850 council person if we divided the 1,700 in half. And so personally, for me, I would like to support that. I think at minimum we start there.
And that would be across the board.
I would be favorable to that. I'd be open to my colleagues, but.
Councilman Hawley.
Oh, I've been sitting here thinking all this good stuff going on. You know, I'm glad you brought that up, because I thought it was already a set deal that we were at $850. I didn't know we went back up. So if we're talking about putting it back at $850, I can live with that. If it was $1,700, then I need to use it this weekend.
Strike that from.
I think it would be to maintain it at the level that we had set.
Yes, I'm in agreement with that.
Unless you have plans this weekend.
I mean, honestly, I can use it this weekend.
Councilman Robinson.
You know, anything to improve the city finances, you know, I agree with it.
I appreciate that, Councilman. I know that you've been a representative of the League of Cities for quite some time now, and we appreciate you attending those meetings and bringing back information from those meetings. But I would certainly agree with Councilman Oliver in if we are going to follow that positive development in Madera, and that is going to be our direction. I don't mind investing a little bit of money in something that would increase our economic outlook.
I agree.
So I would certainly support that recommendation. Mayor Pro Tem Rodriguez.
Yes, thank you, Mayor Medellin. I too am amenable to the idea that Councilman Oliver brought before us, but I'm also amenable to what our city manager had brought in regards to allowing us to also promote ourselves. You know, if we're going to promote positive development, we should also promote positive development within ourselves. And I know outside of Madera, there's so much more. And I got to tell you that I haven't really explored anything outside trainings and what have you. And, you know, these are good developmental outings that we as councilmen, women need in order to, again, promote that positive development within the council. So I'm amenable to it, but also, as Councilman Oliver had mentioned, that if there is a need for us to travel outside of that, we can bring back to the council and hopefully we can get something going there and approved by the council. I hope that that's not something that you would be opposed to, and we can work that way.
We'll take care of that.
Sign me up.
So is that all 7 members going down to 840? Is that what you said? 850?
850.
Well, it's 850, then I'm going to cancel my position in the league. I won't be able to do it.
I think it's fair. I understand completely, Mr. Councilman, but I think that would be a great direction to go.
Okay.
I'd want to bring up one other discussion item that we had in the past, actually last year at this time with budget, regarding early retirement. Not necessarily looking for an answer, but we did this back in 2012, and we had, Wendy, 12 or 14 people take advantage. This last go-around, not so many. Is that something that council is also willing to look at once again this year? It wasn't part of the options.
It certainly can be. If council wants us to explore that, then we'll explore it.
Councilman Hawley.
Yes, I understand that, but I just want to make sure when we look at this, we're not having folks retire out of a position because of the way things are running in the city, then our staff is understaffed. Sometimes we can sit there and go around looking and people decide I want to retire, but I want to make sure that their position is going to be filled so that department won't suffer a big impact because we want to save dollars. So let's think about that as well.
Sure.
So the premise behind an early retirement is if it's a non-critical position, we don't fill it. If it is a critical position, then they do fill it, and the city achieves savings via the lower salary. So we just completed that December.
So we just
And we didn't have very many takers, but we'll certainly explore that again and see. What was the threshold last time as an incentive? 20,000? So if you want to stay at that, if you want to look at a dollar value tied to how many years of service, there's some different options. We probably need, I think, Ms. Silva probably needs some direction on how she moves forward with that, if that's something that you're interested in looking at again.
Does that matter?
Thank you. No, we can actually discuss that under an agenda title on tomorrow night's agenda. And if council wants to give authorization to move forward, or we can have further discussion later if you want to have some options forecasted out. So we can look at that.
I think it's an option for possibly some employees to let the decision be theirs. So I would like to explore that.
Okay.
Let me see.
Councilman Robinson.
Yeah, I think also, since, the public had brought up, health insurance, maybe we should eliminate health insurance for the council, city council. That's a big saving right there. With FERS, becoming larger and health care getting larger, we have to trim the fat.
I think those are discussions that we're actually having now.
Tomorrow night.
If I may, on health insurance for city council members are considered full-time employees of the city, and so there's some Affordable Care Act requirements. We'd have to make sure that we were able to drop it completely. We could maybe look at the levels of coverage that are offered, but we may have to keep at a minimum employee-only coverage with a certain amount of required contribution.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Wonderful. Thanks again, everybody. I'll move into council reports, starting on my far right with Councilman Robinson.
Nothing to report.
Councilwoman Gallegos.
Nothing to report.
Councilman Rigby.
Nothing to report.
Councilman Hawley.
Can I go last?
Mayor Pro Tem Rodriguez.
Sure. Remember, I had an opportunity to come into this chambers, and I wanted to thank Chief Lawson for putting together this celebration for was it the first Spanish-speaking Citizens Academy, which was pretty good. The attendance was great. I mean, the room was filled, but more importantly, you know, the people that were here really have an understanding of what the police department's all about, which I thought was great. I hope that you continue to promote that, and not necessarily in Spanish, but in all languages, where, you know, most of your community can really get to see and have an opportunity to really know what the police department does on a day-to-day basis. And you know, I think this is one of the first steps that the police department can do in order to show its commitment to its residents. So I was very pleased to see the crowd, very pleased to see what was out there. Sergeant Steve, thank you so much for putting this together as well. I think that's probably a byproduct of what you had brought to the department, Steve, so thank you. Appreciate everything you guys done. And more importantly, you know, I wanted to say thank you for the people that attended your academy. So thank you, Chief.
And I will speak on behalf of Chief Lawson. He appreciates your participation in that.
Well, thank you.
Councilman Oliver.
Nothing to report.
Councilman Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for letting me be last.
Welcome.
I want all of you to know I finally got an opportunity to go to Washington, D.C. So for the next week, I'll be gone. So if you look for me, I'll be over there talking to Trump. And y'all want to send, y'all can tell me. But yes, I had this great opportunity to work at an agency that has asked me to go as for the migrant workers as well as the Head Start workers to go over there and help lobby for CAPMC here in Madera as well as throughout California. So I'm just letting you know from Saturday to next Thursday, I will not be available. If you want to call me, might answer my phone. You know, it's a 3-hour difference. Don't have me call you back. It'll be early in the morning. But yes, so also I attended the deal at Madera Unified School District yesterday, and I thank our Councilwoman Gallegos for putting on a nice presentation for the city to those, what they call ASB, yes. So that's the new thing that Madera High is doing. You know, I look at those young ladies and men, are they ready to take our position? Like Superintendent Lau said, they're not the ones for tomorrow, they're the ones for today. So as we educate, was well represented by a lot of dignitaries, and they had a chance to talk and share their ideas and what they're going through. But we have to realize these are our students. These are the ones that Madera is raising. So we have to make sure they're getting the best opportunity to go forward and to take some of these positions that we have here. So just to let you know, it was awesome. I think she done a good job representing the city of Madera, as well as the others did good representing their body. So thank you for that, and I'll see y'all in 2 weeks.
Great. Enjoy your trip, Mr. Councilman, and thank you for representing Madera. And I have nothing to report, so enjoy graduation week, everybody. And we'll see you here tomorrow evening, 6 o'clock.
Graduation tomorrow.